The nearest Veth station was 6 days away. The nearest human station was 4 days away. The third inquiry's captain, a Veth named Vethio who had never in her 200 years of life had any particular occasion to think about humanity in personal terms, sent the emergency signal on all frequencies, and then sat down to do the mathematics of her survival, and found them unfavorable. The human rescue vessel Steadfast arrived in 3 days and 19 hours. It had pushed its drive systems past rated capacity to do it. It would require a full drive rebuild afterward. The captain, a young man named Daniel Osei, 26 years old, who had been a rescue specialist for 3 years and had a quality that his crew described as a deeply irrational bias toward believing situations were recoverable, had made the calculation that his ship could survive the transit if he was lucky, and that the Veth crew would not survive if he wasn't fast, and had simply made the obvious decision. When the Steadfast matched with the third inquiry and the airlock cycled and the human crew came aboard in their suits, Vethio, veteran of 200 years, survivor of the political complexities of 11 centuries of galactic diplomacy, cataloguer the strange and the distant, found herself unable to immediately explain what she was feeling. Later she would write, "They came anyway. They knew the risk to their ship. They pushed beyond their system's rated limits. None of them spoke about it as though it were a heroic decision. They spoke about it the way you speak about the only available option. I do not know if I will ever fully understand the species, but I know that when their ship docked with mine, the young captain came through the airlock first, pulling off his helmet, and looked at me and said, 'Sorry we couldn't get here faster,' as though the apology for lateness were more important than the rescue. I have been thinking about that apology ever since. In the archives of the Galactic Forum, there is a document that exists in all 43 member civilizations' record systems. It has no formal title. It is sometimes called the Okafor Accord, though Okafor had no knowledge of it during her lifetime. It is sometimes called the First Recognition. Vethoru simply called it, in her personal notes, the Acknowledgement. It was compiled over 30 years by the Forum's Historical Assessment Commission, a body that existed to evaluate civilizational developments and issue formal statements for the record. The commission was slow and procedurally conservative and had issued exactly 7 formal statements in its 300-year existence. This was the 8th. It ran to 47 pages in the standard translation, and its conclusions were, by the commission standards, extraordinarily direct. I will quote only a portion of it here, because the rest is detail and context and footnotes, and the essential thing is plain. After 90 years of formal contact, and the accumulated record of that contact in its full complexity, including the developmental velocity data, the conflict records of the Keth Passage and the Silence War, the Forum testimony and subsequent integration history, the rescue record, and the broader pattern of behavioral data, the Commission finds the following. The H.R. 7741, C civilization, self-designated, humanity, does not conform to standard developmental models in any major predictive category. Development speed, anomalous. Conflict response, anomalous. Adaptation rate, anomalous. Civilizational cohesion under external pressure, anomalous. Grief processing and operational continuity following significant losses, anomalous. The Commission declines to assign an upper bound to their developmental trajectory. Previous upper bound estimates have been revised past the point of predictive usefulness. The Commission finds that the concept of containment applied to the civilization is not strategically viable, and has not been strategically viable since approximately the 3rd decade of contact. Attempts at containment have consistently served as accelerants. The Commission formally recognizes humanity as a persistent civilizational presence in the known galaxy, and advises member civilizations to treat them accordingly, as partners or as difficult neighbors, but not as temporary anomalies that will resolve themselves. We note, for the record, that several member civilizations predicted in the early contact period that this species would either collapse under developmental pressure or be absorbed into existing frameworks. Neither has occurred. We note further that several member civilizations attempted to shape or limit humanity's development and found the results contrary to their intentions. We note further that one member civilization engaged in prolonged military conflict with humanity and found, at the conflict's end, that they had inadvertently contributed to significant advances in human military technology. The galaxy has encountered many civilizations. We have not previously encountered one for which every obstacle has served as a developmental resource. We do not know what they will be in 1,000 years. We do not know what they will be in 100. We are no longer confident we can predict what they will be in 20. What we know is what the record shows. They persist. They adapt. They remember everything. They do not accept limits as permanent. The galaxy should plan accordingly. Vethor died 2 years after the commission statement was issued, old even by Veth standards, still working, still updating her notes. The final entry in her research journal, written 3 days before she died, in the slightly unsteady notation of someone whose hands were tired, was brief. It said, "I was wrong about the ceiling. There is no ceiling. I should have known this when I first read their history, a species that looked at a finite planet and said, 'This is not enough. We will go elsewhere.' They did not wait for permission from the universe. They simply went. Index, undefined. Recommend further study. Recommend also, for whatever it is worth, the following. Do not make them angry without a plan for what they do next. Do not mistake their grief for weakness, and do not, under any circumstances, assume that any situation is hopeless in their presence. They appear constitutionally unable to agree that it is. This has been the most interesting 60 years of my career. I would like the record to show that. The standard protocol for a civilization at humanity's developmental stage was observation, minimum 20 additional years, reassessment at decade intervals. Veth, now a senior analyst, considerably less junior, had flagged a file for early review not because of any single dramatic development, but because of an accumulation of small things that kept failing to fit the model. The species had not collapsed. This sounds like a low bar. It was not. The historical record of civilizations at the carbon industrial stage was poor. Resource depletion, atmospheric destabilization, political fragmentation under ecological stress. The failure modes were well documented, and they clustered in predictable window. HR 7741. C was in that window. The indicators were present. The models predicted, with 73% confidence, significant civilizational contraction within a century. But the species kept doing something the models didn't predict. They adapted, not smoothly, not efficiently, not without enormous suffering and catastrophic regional failures that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of the end. But every time the model said, "Now, here is where it falls apart," the species did something unexpected. They invented a new technology. They formed an unprecedented coalition. They redirected resources in ways that violated their own stated economic principles. They sacrificed things they had previously declared non-negotiable. And they kept going. Veth had been watching them for 37 years. She had attended 17 internal review panels where colleagues argued, with reasonable data, that the civilization was entering terminal decline. She had watched 17 times as the civilization declined to do what the model said it would. The threat index had moved to 3 when they achieved fusion energy, to 4 when they established permanent Martian settlement without losing the colony in the first decade, which was statistically improbable, to 5, which triggered mandatory review, when they cracked the preliminary mathematics of gravitational wave manipulation. 5 was where the Veth started paying attention. 6 was where they started being careful. The Meridian was humanity's first deep space vessel capable of reaching the heliopause. It was crude by any metric, but Veth had read the development timelines, and she had done the extrapolation, and she had brought her findings to the senior council with a level of urgency that made her colleagues uncomfortable. "They are 60 years from achieving functional gravitational drives," she said. "Possibly 50. The council found this implausible. The mathematics, they said, was a significant jump. Species didn't make that jump in 50 years. Their threat index is 5.2, said Council Elder Vedron, who was 900 years old and had personally cataloged 31 civilizations. "We have time. I would ask the Council to look at the historical volatility data," Veth said. "This species does not follow historical models. All species say that," Vethron replied, and that was the end of the meeting. Veth went home and stared at her data for a long time. Then she made a decision that was slightly outside her authority and would later be described, depending on who was telling the story, as either prescient or insubordinate. She authorized first contact. Commander Okafor's report to Earth took 4 light hours to arrive and another 4 to get a response. In those 8 hours, the Meridian and the Veth vessel, which the crew had taken to Colin Cathedral because of its shape, maintained a cautious proximity. Communications continuing. Diallo worked without sleep for 31 hours straight, building a translation framework. She was not the most methodical person in her field, and later she would admit that some of her early interpretive choices were intuitive rather than rigorous. But she had a gift that the more rigorous linguists lacked, which was the ability to feel her way toward meaning through ambiguity. "They're curious about us," she told Okafor, around hour 20. "But it's not the curiosity of equals. It's more like," she searched for the word, "scientific curiosity. The way a researcher is curious about an interesting specimen." "Comforting," said Okafor dryly. "They have a word. I keep encountering it in their communications. I can't quite pin it down. Something like index value, but also weight or significance. It seems to be how they measure civilizations." "How do we measure?" Diallo was quiet for a moment. "Average. Slightly above average." Okafor looked out at the cathedral, vast and impossibly clean-lined in the darkness. "Tell them," she said, "that we like to learn more about the galactic community, that we want to understand what's out there." The vet's response was carefully worded. They were not, they explained, in the habit of introducing young civilizations to the galactic community abruptly. It was, and here the translation got complicated, not good for the young civilizations, or for the community. "They're saying we're not ready." Diallo translated. "Tell them we'll be the judge of that." The Veth found this response interesting. Veth Oru, monitoring the exchange in real time from the Veth vessel, noted in her log, "Species does not defer to established authority structures. Reacts to paternalism with assertion rather than deference." Unexpected. What followed, the 18 months of careful negotiation that brought humanity its first formal relationship with an alien species, has been written about extensively in the historical record, and most of those accounts focus on diplomacy, the formal accords, the information exchange protocols, the establishment of the Joint Understanding Commission. What those accounts tend to underemphasize is how much of it happened through sheer stubbornness. The Veth's initial offer was observer status. Humanity would be given access to certain catalog information about the galactic community, would be permitted to trade in a limited set of goods, and would be introduced gradually to other civilizations at the Veth's discretion. In return, humanity would agree to a development freeze on certain technologies, specifically gravitational drive research. Earth's response was no. Not a negotiated no. Not a let us discuss the parameters no. A flat, unambiguous no, delivered personally by Secretary General Adiz Nwachukwu in a broadcast message that Veth Oru later described in her reports as remarkable for its directness and its apparent lack of awareness that the other party had 17 times our military capacity. "We will not freeze any research program," Nwachukwu said. "We will not accept observer status in a community that affects our security. We will not agree to manage introduction at your schedule. We are willing to discuss mutual agreements on information sharing, on trade protocols, on diplomatic norms. We are not willing to agree to our own limitation." The Veth conclave debated for 3 months. Vethron argued that the appropriate response was simply to withdraw contact and allow the species to develop, or fail to develop, on its own timeline. Several other council members agreed. The humans were posturing. They said, young civilizations always posture. Give them time, and they would become more reasonable. Veth Oru said nothing during these debates. She was watching the humanity-facing data streams. In the 3 months the Veth were deliberating, humanity had accelerated its gravitational drive research by 40%. They had done this not through any secret knowledge or alien assistance, but through the simple expedient of redirecting an enormous amount of resources and brain power to the problem, because now they had a reason to solve it faster. She brought this data to the council. There was a longer silence than usual after she presented it. "They know we might withdraw," said Councilmember Vethsa slowly, "and they're treating that as a race condition." "Yes," said Veth Oru. "They're trying to become capable enough that our withdrawal doesn't matter." "Yes." Vethron was quiet for a very long time. How long until they achieve functional drives at this rate? 30 years, possibly 25. The Council accepted humanity's terms. 20 years later, the human ship Threshold achieved the first successful gravitational fold on record by a species, less than 200 years into its spacefaring development. The Veth noted this. So did several other civilizations who have been watching, with varying degrees of concern, as the young oxygen breathers from HR 7741 see decline to slow down. The Dren Remnancy, the surviving fragment of the civilization Vethor's predecessors had catalogued 11 centuries ago, sent a formal inquiry to the Veth Conclave. What is your assessment of the HR 7741 C developmental trajectory? Veth Oru, who was by now the Conclave's foremost expert on humanity and had 17 researchers working under her, wrote the response personally. Assessment: anomalous. Development speed is 2.3 times historical median for comparable civilizations. Technological acquisition is accelerating rather than plateauing, which contradicts standard models. Political cohesion has increased rather than decreased under contact stress, which contradicts 89% of historical precedent. Species has demonstrated willingness to absorb severe losses without strategic retreat. Behavioral volatility remains high, but appears to be a feature rather than a liability. The species exploits its own unpredictability. Current threat index, 6.8. Recommendation: engage rather than contain. Containment attempts have historically accelerated their development. Engagement may allow integration into established frameworks. She sent it, then sat looking at her display for a while. She had written threat index, 6.8, and she knew it was probably already wrong. The assessment had taken 6 weeks to compile. Things had changed in 6 weeks. Things always change faster than you expected with these people. The first real test came not from the Veth, who had learned to be cautious, but from a civilization that had not been paying attention. The Keth were an old species, proud in the way that very old things are proud, with a kind of geological certainty in their own permanence. They had held the Keth Passage, a navigational corridor through a complex nebular region, for 4,000 years. The passage connected 7 inhabited systems, and they charged transit fees. This was normal galactic commerce. Everyone did it. The Veth had 2 similar arrangements. The Dren Remnancy had 1. Even the Sorak Collective had a minor trade route they controlled. What was not normal was what the Keth did when a human cargo vessel, the Abundance, attempted to transit the passage without pre-authorization in the 32nd year of humanity's galactic integration. The Keth seized a vessel. This was within their legal rights under galactic commerce law. Technically, the Abundance had not filed the proper documentation. The captain, a woman named Suyun Park, 20 years in deep freight, famously impatient with bureaucracy, had considered the transit a minor procedural oversight that could be sorted out with a small fine and a few hours of paperwork. The Keth held the Abundance for 93 days. They released the cargo but held the vessel and crew as bond against what they calculated, under a formula no human had previously seen, as unpaid transit fees compounding over the 16 years humanity had been using the passage without paying, a charge, it turned out, that had been added to the trade agreement in a subsection that the human diplomatic team had, in retrospect, not thoroughly translated. The charge was approximately 4.7 billion standard units. Earth's annual stellar trade revenue was 2.1 billion standard units. Earth's initial response was diplomatic. Formal protest. Request for mediation. The Keth refused mediation, citing the legitimacy of their claim under established law. And they were right. Under established law, the claim was legitimate. Earth's second response was legal. They filed with the Galactic Trade Arbitration Body, a process that typically took 8 to 12 years to reach resolution. Earth's third response came from the Threshold, which arrived at the edge of Keth space with 2 accompanying vessels, not military vessels, technically, because humanity at this point didn't have a recognized galactic military, and requested a conversation. The Keth sector governor, whose name translated approximately as Vetch Prime of the Third Current, received the human delegation with the mild contempt he reserved for young species. He had dealt with 7 other species during his tenure. All of them had eventually paid. The lead human negotiator was a man named Ibrahim Saleh, who had a law degree, a background in hostage negotiation, and a quality that didn't translate well into Keth behavioral frameworks. He seemed genuinely unbothered, not performing calm. Actually calm, in the way of someone who has already decided how this ends and is just waiting for events to catch up. "We will not pay the retroactive fee," Sala said. "Then your vessel and crew remain in bond. They will be released within 60 days. The governor found this amusing. "On what basis do you make this assertion?" "Because if they are not released within 60 days, Sala said, "the transit fee revenue you earn from the 17 human vessels currently using the passage will stop permanently, and we will establish an alternate route through Farath Drift, which I understand you do not control, and we will offer all 17 of the other species currently using your passage the same alternate route at reduced fees, and we will undercut your monopoly until it's worth nothing." The governor's amusement diminished. The Farath Drift is uncharted. No vessel has successfully navigated it. "We've been charting it for 4 years," Sala said. "We started when we realized there might be a legal dispute over the passage." This was, Vetch Prime of the Third Current would later reflect, the moment he understood that these creatures were something different. It wasn't the preparation. Preparation was normal. Any civilization could prepare. It was a timeline. They had started preparing for a negotiation that had not yet occurred, over a dispute that had not yet materialized, for years before anyone knew there was going to be a conflict. They had done it not because they knew. They had done it because they didn't know. And not knowing made them prepare for everything. The Abundance and her crew were released in 51 days. The retroactive fee was never paid. The alternate route through the Farath Drift opened for commerce 18 months later, and within a decade it carried 30% of the traffic that had previously used the Keth Passage. The Keth filed a complaint with the Galactic Trade Arbitration Body. It took 11 years to resolve. The Keth lost. The report that Vethoru sent to Galactic Civilizations Forum following the Keth Passage incident was 12 pages long, dense with data and extrapolation, and it concluded with a paragraph that would be quoted, misquoted, argued over, and ultimately vindicated for the next 2 centuries. The H.R. 7741 sees civilization demonstrates what I have termed adversarial memory. Every conflict becomes data. Every loss becomes a design constraint. They did not simply respond to threats. They used threats as architecture for future capability. The Keth dispute cost them nothing. It gave them the Farath Drift, which they would otherwise have lacked strategic motivation to chart. I am no longer comfortable assigning a threat index below 7.5. I am also no longer comfortable with the concept of threat index as an adequate metric for the civilization. The index assumes a maximum. I am no longer certain this species has won. The conflict with the Vorth began over nothing that mattered and ended with a silence that lasted 40 years. The Vorth were not malicious. They were not cruel. They were, by galactic standards, a moderate civilization of the Middle Period, competent, stable, reasonably ethical. They had a strong tradition of territorial exclusivity and a deep cultural framework around the concept of dominion, which was less about aggression and more about a near-religious conviction that physical space carried spiritual meaning. Their territory was sacred. The boundary of their territory was sacred. The act of crossing that boundary without invitation was not, to the Vorth, a technical violation of law. It was a desecration. No one had fully explained this to the human survey teams operating in the rimward sectors. The Copernicus, a survey vessel charting what human databases labeled as unclaimed space. The Vorth did not label anything. Why would sacred ground need a label? Cross a boundary on a spring morning by Earth reckoning, detected a habitable planet, and began detailed surface scans. 3 Vorth warships appeared 14 hours later. The Copernicus attempted to communicate. The Vorth did not respond to communication. The Vorth response to boundary violation was not dialogue. It was removal. The Copernicus was struck twice. Warning shots by Vorth standards, but the crew of the survey vessel did not know that, and began emergency retreat. 1 crew member died in the first strike. Her name was Dr. Kenji Watanabe, and he had been 4 months from retirement. He had a wife and 2 grandchildren. The Copernicus survived. The survivors reached human space and reported. The report included the exact coordinates of the engagement, the specifications of the Vorth weapon systems, analyzed from the impact data, and the operational behavior of the 3 warships, all of which had been continuously observed and recorded by the Copernicus' science team even while under fire. Humanity's diplomatic response was immediate and extensive. They sought mediation. They attempted to understand the Vorath concept of territorial sanctity. They offered restitution. They expressed in 17 different communication formats and through 3 intermediary civilizations genuine sorrow for the unintentional violation. The Vorath did not respond. Not because they didn't receive the messages. Not because they were planning a countermove. The Vorath simply did not believe that dialogue was appropriate with civilization that had desecrated their boundary. You did not discuss desecration. You removed the source of it. 22 months after the Copernicus incident, a Vorath fleet of 43 ships entered human space and destroyed 3 mining stations in the outer system. No warning. No communication. 612 people died. I have been trying to describe this period from the outside, from Vethru's perspective and the perspective of the Galactic record. But the Silence War, the name came from the Vorath's refusal to speak, their 40-year campaign of unexplained, unannounced strikes against human infrastructure, cannot be properly understood from the outside. What you need to understand is what it felt like to be a civilization that was being hunted by something that wouldn't tell you why. The Vorath were not trying to destroy humanity. Their strategic objective was expulsion, to make the cost of humanity's rimward presence so high that the species would retreat. They had done this before with 2 other civilizations, and it had worked. Both civilizations had withdrawn. What they had not encountered before was a species that had been, for most of its existence, unable to withdraw. Human civilization had developed on a single planet with finite resources and no exit option. The evolutionary and cultural firmware of the species was written for a context where retreat was not available, where you adapted to the threat or you died, because there was nowhere else to go. This was, in the long view of their history, often brutal. But it produced something, a civilizational immune response to the concept of giving ground that ran deeper than strategy, deeper than policy, deeper than rational calculation. The Vorath struck the mining stations and waited for the retreat signals. Instead, the mining stations were rebuilt, faster, with better armor and point defense systems derived from the weapons analysis the Copernicus had performed while under fire. The Vorath struck again. 12 ships this time, targeting the supply lines to the rimward survey operations. The survey operations did not stop. New routes were established. Decoy vessels were deployed. The supply lines multiplied from 3 to 11, distributed across a volume of space large enough that 12 Vorath ships could not effectively interdict all of them. The Vorath committed more resources. 20 ships. 30. Humanity did something that the Vorath could not understand and had no framework for. They got angry. Not in the Vorath sense of anger, which was a cold and purposeful emotion that led to systematic action. Humans got angry in the raw, fuel-burning, sometimes irrational way of creatures whose emotional system had evolved to override reason when reason said this cannot be survived. They got angry, and that anger became energy, and that energy became production and adaptation. And in the 5th year of the Silence War, humanity launched its first purpose-built warships. They weren't the best warships the galaxy had ever seen. They were, by the assessment of the Veth military analysts who observed the first engagement, about 30 years behind the Vorath in terms of weapon sophistication and shield technology. But there were more of them than anyone had expected, and they were crewed by people who were very, very angry. The first battle of what would be called the Kirin engagement lasted 6 hours. Humanity lost 9 ships. The Vorath lost 4. By conventional military analysis, this was a Vorath tactical victory. But humanity had not been trying to win the battle. They had been trying to gather data. Every ship in the engagement had been running continuous sensor sweeps at maximum resolution, recording every Vorath weapon's discharge, every shield frequency, every navigational pattern. The Kirin data package, named for the lead vessel of the human fleet, was transmitted in real time to 17 research facilities. 300 scientists began working on it immediately. 11 months later, humanity deployed counter-shield technology that reduced the effectiveness of Vorath's standard weapons by approximately 60%. The Vorath had never encountered an opponent that used defeat as a research methodology. The Silence War lasted 40 years. It was not continuous combat. There were long stretches of cautious quiet, both sides assessing and rebuilding. But the Vorth never communicated, and humanity never stopped expanding. And periodically the quiet would end, and ships would burn, and people would die, and both civilizations would learn something they didn't know before. By year 15, humanity had achieved weapons parity. By year 23, humanity had achieved a marginal superiority in shield systems and point defense. By year 30, the Vorth were losing more ships than humanity in every engagement. The Vorth had a word for this concept, the arc of the conflict, with the intended outcome inverted into its opposite. The word translated, imperfectly, as something like the wound that teaches the enemy to hurt you better. It was considered the worst possible outcome of military action. Their tradition had extensive case studies of it, philosophical frameworks for avoiding it, cultural mechanisms for recognizing the warning signs. The warning signs had all been there. They had simply not believed that a civilization as young as humanity could reverse the arc in 40 years. The Vorth reached out to the Veth conclave in the 39th year of the conflict. "We wish to understand," their communication said, "how to end this without further loss. They will not retreat. We have never encountered a species that would not retreat." Vethoru, who was now very old and very tired and had spent the better part of 4 decades watching this conflict with a combination of professional fascination and personal dread, drafted the response herself. They will not retreat, because retreat is not part of their available options, not strategically. Culturally, they experience the concept of territorial loss as existential threat, regardless of the strategic calculus. The only path to ending this conflict is to offer them something they can call a victory. They are not unreasonable. They understand compromise. But they will not accept terms that feel like surrender, because surrender for this species does not end conflicts. It merely delays them and increases the cost. Recommendation: acknowledge the initial incident as a mutual misunderstanding. Offer recognition of human territorial claims in the rimward sectors. Propose a boundary framework with joint stewardship of contested zones. They will accept this. It will feel to them like having defended their ground, which they will then protect. A species that protects its ground is a stable neighbor. A species that feels it was forced to yield is not. The Vorth took 3 months to consider this. Then they sent a message, not to the Veth, but directly to humanity's diplomatic authority. It was the first communication the Vorth had sent to humanity in 40 years. The Silence War ended. 60 years after Meridian made first contact, humanity attended its first full session of the Galactic Civilizations Forum. The forum met every 20 years, a gathering of the 43 recognized civilizations of a known galaxy, each represented by a delegation. Each delegation allocated time to speak on matters of collective concern. The forum had no enforcement authority. It was, essentially, a room where the galaxy talked to itself. But the room mattered. The talking mattered. Being there mattered. Humanity had observer status for the first 2 sessions after their integration. They sat in the gallery and listened and submitted written questions through the Veth intermediaries and were largely ignored, which suited most of the delegations because humanity at that stage was a manageable quantity, a young species in its early development, not yet threatening, interesting only to specialists. The 3rd session, they arrived with full membership. Full membership had been contested. The Keth, still bitter about the Ferath drift, had filed objections. The Miran Ecclesiasti had theological concerns about humanity's lack of what they considered a civilization-unifying spiritual framework. The fact that humanity had hundreds of religions was, to the Miran, evidence of civilizational incoherence. Several smaller civilizations had no opinion, but voted against on principle, because young species at the forum were a nuisance. The vote had passed anyway, 27-16, because the Veth had sponsored humanity's membership and the Veth sponsorship carried weight, and because the Vorth, whose opposition would have been assumed by anyone watching, had abstained. The abstention was not explained. It did not need to be. The forum met on a neutral station in deep space, a vast structure that had been built by a species that no longer existed, maintained by collective agreement, neutral by tradition. The station's atmosphere was managed to accommodate the respiratory needs of all 43 civilizations, which require remarkable engineering, and produced air that tasted, to human senses, slightly of minerals and something that defied description. Yael Okafor, retired now, 60 years older, white-haired and somewhat difficult on her best days, had been asked to lead the human delegation. She had agreed after minimal persuasion, mostly because she was curious, and also because she still had that quality she'd had on the bridge of the Meridian. The quality of looking at a situation and thinking, what can we do before what should we feel? She sat at the human delegations table in the forum chamber and looked around at 43 civilizations and felt something she didn't quite have a word for. Not awe, exactly. Not triumph. Something more like recognition. The sense that this was where the story had been pointing, even if you hadn't known it while it was happening. The session opened with a standard agenda: territorial disputes, trade adjustments, the ongoing crisis in the Dren Remnancy, which had been in varying states of ongoing crisis for 11 centuries and showed no sign of resolving. Humanity was scheduled to speak in the third session, after the Veth and before the Sorak Collective. What changed the agenda was the Pale Architects. The Pale Architects were not a civilization in the standard sense. They were old, genuinely old, predating the Forum itself, predating most of the Forum's member civilizations. They communicated rarely, and when they did, it was significant. They had not sent a delegation to the last 3 Forum sessions. They sent one now. The Pale Architects representative, a towering structure of bioluminescent filaments that managed to convey enormous age and patience, requested the floor outside standard agenda procedure, which was allowed under Forum protocols in cases of urgent galactic concern. The chamber went still. What the Pale Architect said, translated through 4 separate intermediary systems, because their communication format was so different from any standard galactic language, was this: we have observed a development requiring attention. A young civilization has, in the span of 3 of their generations, moved from initial spaceflight to functional galactic presence. They have survived contact that has destroyed other young civilizations. They have survived a long conflict. They have done both of these things in ways that violated predictive models. We bring this to the Forum's attention not as a threat assessment, but as an observation. The standard models of civilizational development do not apply to this species. We believe the Forum should acknowledge this. We believe the Forum should think carefully about what this means. The Chamber sat with this for a moment. Then the Keth delegation head, Vetch Prima, the third current successor, said, "The Pale Architects are suggesting we should be concerned about the humans." "The Pale Architects are suggesting," said Vetaru, who had insisted on attending despite being old enough that the journey was difficult, "that we should stop assuming we understand them." Okafor had been sitting quietly through all of this, listening to the translation feed in her earpiece. Her delegation was watching her. She could feel the weight of the chamber. 43 civilizations, thousands of years of accumulated history. The accumulated weight of species that had seen young civilizations rise and fall, and had learned to be cautious about which way they bet. She leaned forward to the speaker pod. "If I may," she said. The Forum protocols were clear. Full member delegations could speak during floor discussion. The chamber did not object, though several delegations shifted in ways that suggested they had expected humanity to remain quiet. Okafor spoke for 7 minutes. She was not a gifted orator. She was not trying to be. She spoke in the way she had always spoken, in the plain, direct cadence of someone who had spent her life at the edge of known space, where clarity mattered more than elegance. "You're trying to figure out what we are," she said. "Fair enough. So are we. We've been alive as a civilization for a fraction of the time most of you have been alive, and we spent most of that time making catastrophic mistakes and then fixing them. We almost destroyed our own planet. More than once. We almost destroyed ourselves in wars over things we can barely remember the reasons for now. Every time someone, including sometimes ourselves, decided we were done, we weren't done." She paused. "I don't know what that means in the long run. I don't know what we're going to be in 1,000 years. I don't know what we'll do when we hit a problem we can't adapt through. Maybe we'll finally find our limit. Maybe we don't have one. I genuinely don't know." She looked around the chamber. "But I want to say something to the Forum, not as a boast, as a fact. We're not going to stop. Whatever your models say, whatever your threat indexes say, whatever your historical precedents say, we are not going to stop. And I think the most useful thing this Forum can do is decide whether that means you treat us as a problem or as a partner, because those 2 choices lead to very different places for all of us." The chamber was quiet. Veth Oru, sitting in the Veth delegation's observation section, watched the other delegation's reactions with the practiced eye of a researcher who had spent 60 years thinking about nothing else. She saw a calculation in the Keth, wariness in the Vorith, something that might have been recognition in the pale architect's bioluminescent filaments, which shifted in a way that her translation system described only as acknowledgement, and in the Miran Ecclesiasti delegation, the civilization that had objected to humanity's membership on the grounds of civilizational incoherence. She saw something she had not expected. She saw, if she was reading the Miran physiological response correctly, something very close to awe. What followed the forum session was not immediate transformation. The galaxy did not reshape itself overnight. Civilizations that had been cautious of humanity remained cautious. The trade frameworks took years to expand. The territorial disputes took decades to resolve. History does not move at the speed of speeches. But something shifted. The shift was hardest to describe and impossible to quantify, but Vethora tried. In the final volume of her life's work, a multi-decade study titled, in the Veth language, something that translated approximately as the anomaly, a study in species that refuse their own limits. The forum session, she wrote, was not the turning point. There is no single turning point. What happened at the forum was that the galaxy stopped pretending. For 60 years, we had been treating humanity as a development to manage. After the forum, we were no longer able to maintain that pretense. Not because they threatened us, not because they demanded recognition, but because Okafor stood in that chamber and said the thing that everyone in the room already knew and no one had yet been willing to say aloud. They are not going to stop. The models have been revised 17 times since first contact. Each revision increases projected development speed. Each revision decreases confidence interval. We are now operating in a predictive framework that produces essentially one output. Humanity will continue to change in ways we do not anticipate, at speeds we do not expect, and the variables we are not measuring will consistently prove more important than the ones we are. I have spent 60 years of my career on this. I am not ashamed to admit that I do not fully understand it. What I understand is this. The galaxy has seen many civilizations that were strong, many that were clever, many that were durable. We have not seen one that was all three, and also appeared to experience setback as a form of nutrition. The loss of the Watanabe incident in the early Silence War. They named every ship class in the next generation of warships after Vorth weapon systems. Not as a threat, as a reminder. They build memory into their technology. Every wound becomes architecture. How do you defeat a civilization that builds out of its own defeats? I am not certain you do. I am not certain the question is the right one. The generation that came after Okafor's grew up in a different galaxy than she had. There is a child, there are many children, but I am thinking of one in particular. Born 20 years after the forum session, in a station above the fourth planet of a system that had no name in human records when Okafor was born. The child's name is Miko. Her mother is an engineer. Her father is a xenolinguist who worked on 3 separate translation frameworks and is currently arguing with a Veth academic about the correct interpretation of a Keth cultural document from 2 centuries ago. Miko grew up knowing the Veth the way earlier generations had known geography, as a fact of the world, complex and sometimes difficult and occasionally surprising, but fundamentally there. She grew up knowing that the Vorth were difficult neighbors but reliable ones, in their way. She grew up knowing the story of the Copernicus, the way children in previous centuries had known stories of difficult passages and hard winters, not as trauma, but as a kind of history that explains why the present is what it is. She studies xenoarchaeology. She is interested in the civilizations that are gone, the ones the Veth cataloged and watched and noted as they dimmed. She wants to understand, she says, what they were like when they were still alive, before the record. She has this quality that people who know her have difficulty describing. Her Veth academic partner, an exchange student named Vethcom, great-grandchild of Ethur's research lineage, once tried to put into words. She is not afraid of not knowing, Vethcom said. Most people are when they encounter genuine uncertainty. They reach for certainty even when it isn't available. Miko looks at a gap in the record and treats it like a place she hasn't been yet. Vethcom thought about this for a while after saying it, and then said something else. I wonder if that's inherited. There is a moment. There are many moments, but I keep returning to this one. That happened 18 years after the forum session. Not famous, not recorded in the formal histories, but I think it matters more than most of the famous moments. A Veth survey ship, the Third Inquiry, experienced a catastrophic drive failure in deep space, in a region between systems that was technically unclaimed but practically impassable. The Third Inquiry had 14 crew members. Their emergency communications reached the nearest Veth station in approximately 6 days, which was also approximately how long their life support could operate at reduced capacity. The Veth had been cataloging civilizations for 11,000 years. They were good at it, methodical, patient in a way that only a species with a 300-year lifespan could be patient. Not philosophically, not as a learned virtue, but biologically, the way a mountain is patient. They had cataloged the Dren, who built cities of sound and collapsed when their star dimmed. They had cataloged the Mirati, who achieved faster-than-light travel 3 separate times and forgot it twice. They had cataloged the Sorak Collective, the Pale Architects, the Burning Cordovish, hundreds of civilizations across 12 spiral arms, each one file, cross-reference, and assigned a threat index. The threat index went from 0 to 9. No civilization had ever broken 8. So when the probe reached the third planet of a yellow dwarf in an unremarkable system on the outer edge of the Orion Spur, the cataloger assigned to that sector, a junior analyst named Vethoru, for decades into what would be a long and largely uneventful career, logged the initial observations with a mild interest of someone who had seen this before. Oxygen atmosphere, liquid water, carbon-based biology, one large moon, tidally locked rotation stabilized. Conditions favorable for complex life. She assigned the preliminary designation HR 7741C and began the standard survey. What she found was initially unremarkable. The dominant species, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, approximately 1.7 meters average height, had achieved spaceflight, crude spaceflight, the kind that involved chemical propellants and significant structural inefficiency, and what appeared to be a deeply irrational willingness to strap organic bodies onto controlled explosions. They had one orbital station, aging. They had planted flags on their moon, though they had not returned in several generations. They had sent mechanical probes to several neighboring planets and the outer giants of their system. They had not yet made contact with any other civilization. Vethor noted their chemical propulsion, their rudimentary electromagnetic communications, their single inhabited world. She noted the political fragmentation, hundreds of separate governance structures on a single planet, which was usually an indicator of limited long-term stability. She noted the atmospheric carbon readings, suggesting industrial activity beginning to strain their ecological systems. She assigned them a threat index of 2. That was generous, honestly. Most species at this stage of development got a 1, or occasionally a 1.5 if they showed unusual theoretical science. But there was something in the observation data that made her pause, something she couldn't quite quantify through the standard metrics. The species fought constantly, not the organized warfare of the Dren, which was almost ceremonial, not the cold resource competition of the Sorak. These creatures fought each other with extraordinary creativity and apparent emotional investment over things that had no survival value whatsoever. Ideas, symbols, abstract concepts of territory that existed only in their collective imagination. They fought, and then they stopped, and then some of them helped the people they had just been fighting, and then they fought again. Their history was a continuous catastrophe that they kept surviving. Vethor flagged the file with a notation, non-standard behavioral volatility, recommend monitoring. Then she moved on to the next system. That was 37 years ago. The Veth made first contact with humanity on a Tuesday, specifically at 1423 station time aboard the ISCS Meridian, a deep space research vessel roughly 4 light hours beyond the heliopause, conducting survey operations under Commander Yal Okafor. There were 11 crew members. 3 of them were asleep. One was in the middle of a video call with her daughter, who was turning 7 in 2 days, and the connection lag made the conversation mostly smiles and waving. The Veth ship appeared without warning, not because it had no warning systems, but because it had not considered it necessary to warn these people. The way you don't announce yourself to a deer. Commander Okafor was on the bridge when the contact alarm sounded. She had been doing paperwork. She looked up at the sensor display, and her first thought was not fear or wonder or any of the grand emotions she had imagined as a child that this moment would contain. Her first thought was, that is a very large ship. Her second thought was, we are very far from home. Her third thought, which arrived about 4 seconds after the first two, was calm in the way that people under severe stress are sometimes calm, the calm of someone who has decided that panic is not a useful option right now. Okay, what do we know? What can we do? What are our options? She keyed the all-ship intercom. General quarters. All hands to stations. This is not a drill. She paused, then added, because it felt important to say it clearly. We have contact. The Veth vessel was 2.3 kilometers long. The meridian was 340 meters. The crew of 11 stared at it on the visual display for 31 seconds before the first communication attempt came through. A signal on 17 simultaneous frequencies, a pattern of mathematical relationships that the Meridian's translation suite identified as a greeting after about 90 seconds of processing. Dr. Amara Diallo, the Meridian's Zen linguistic specialist, was the one who actually made the call. She had been asleep when the alarm sounded. She arrived on the bridge still pulling her hair back, sat down at her station, and began working. The Veth message was, essentially, we know you are here. We have always known you are here. Do not be alarmed. You are a young species, and we mean you no harm. Diallo translated it back to Commander Okafor, who listened, and then was quiet for a moment. Asked them, Okafor said carefully, how long they've been watching us. The answer came back, 37 years. Asked them why they're making contact now. This answer took longer. There was a back and forth, Diallo working through the mathematical linguistic framework they'd established, the Meridian's computers straining. Finally, she turned to Okafor with an expression that Okafor couldn't quite read. They say, Diallo said, that our threat index has changed. Okafor looked at her. What does that mean? I'm not entirely sure, but I think they're saying we become more interesting. The Veth conclave had not intended to make contact yet. The Steadfast was decommissioned 15 years after the third Inquiry rescue. She was too old for active service and too expensive to refit. The crew attended the decommissioning ceremony, which is a human tradition. They say goodbye to ships the way they say goodbye to people, because to them a ship is not just machinery, but the accumulated weight of every decision made aboard her, every crisis survived, every moment when the mast said no and the crew said anyway. Daniel Osei, the young captain who had pushed the drive past rated limits, had been promoted twice since. He was 41 now, and there were lines in his face that had not been there at 26. He touched the hull of the Steadfast one last time before they stripped her for parts. Someone asked him later what it felt like. He thought about it for a while. The way he thought about things, slowly, looking at them from several angles, as if checking for the part he had missed. She got us there, he said finally. That's what I keep thinking. We pushed her past the limit, and she got us there. He was quiet for a moment. I think about those Veth crew members sometimes, whether they still think about it, whether it meant something to them, the way it meant something to me. He paused. I think it did. I think that's the thing, you know? We were strangers to each other, and we showed up anyway. And that's the thing that crosses every barrier, every species, every way you can be different. You show up when someone's in trouble. He looked at the ship. That's not a human thing. That's just a good thing. We figured that out the same as they'll figure out. We're just maybe a little more. He stopped and smiled. And the smile had that quality his crew knew well, the quality that meant he was about to say something that sounded simple and wasn't. We're maybe a little more committed to the principle. He turned and walked away from the ship, and the Steadfast waited quietly to be taken apart and remade into something new. In the 63rd year of human galactic integration, the Forum commissioned a survey of all member civilizations asking them to identify, in their own cultural language, what they consider the defining characteristic of the HR 7741C species. The responses varied. Several civilizations cited developmental speed. Several cited military adaptability. The Veth cited behavioral unpredictability. The Vorth cited what they called, in translation, the refusal of defeat. The pale architect submitted a single image, a scar tissue cell, magnified, showing the dense collagen matrix that forms when a wound heals, harder than the original tissue, changed by damage, permanently marked by it, but intact. They offered no further explanation. The forum archivist filed it under the heading, Humanity, Defining Characteristics, and left it there for anyone who wanted to understand.